It was February 7th, 2022, when federal agents pushed through a Pawtucket apartment door, catching a pill press still warm as it had just been running minutes earlier. As officers moved deeper inside, blue tablets stamped M30 covered folding tables while bags of powder sat open, showing this was not a quick hustle but a full operation. While one man tried slipping toward the back exit, another got pinned to the ground in seconds, which made it clear this place had been watched for a long time. As agents stepped outside, they noticed how close the building sat to a school, which raised a question nobody could ignore: how something pushing millions of pills stayed hidden around kids. So to understand how this even got here, we have to rewind the story. Rhode Island does not look like a place that would sit in the middle of a national drug pipeline, since it covers barely over 1,000 square miles while sitting between Boston and New York like a pass-through nobody really watches. That location matters more than people realize, since Interstate 95 cuts straight through Providence, while ports along the coast keep goods moving quietly without drawing attention. When you combine that with a population of just over 1 million, you get a place where movement feels normal, which made it easier for certain operations to blend into everyday life without raising alarms. That quiet setup did not just appear overnight, since the groundwork goes back to the 1990s when Dominican families began settling heavily in Providence and nearby Pawtucket, building restaurants, bodegas, and barbershops that shaped entire neighborhoods. While most people came chasing stability, a smaller group found opportunity in the street economy, especially as older crime structures faded after the cocaine wave from the mid-'80s slowed down. As those earlier networks weakened, younger crews filled the gap, using connections from New York, Massachusetts, and even back home in the Dominican Republic to keep product moving in a way that stayed low-key but consistent. By the time the 2000s rolled into the 2010s, the drug scene started shifting again, since heroin demand held steady, but new synthetic options began entering the picture, which changed how everything worked. Fentanyl showed up across the Northeast around the mid-2010s, and once it hit Providence, it did not take long before traffickers realized it moved differently from traditional substances. Since it required smaller quantities to generate bigger returns, it allowed crews to operate with less physical risk while still making serious money, which naturally pulled more players into the game. That shift mattered even more once traffickers figured out that fentanyl did not need to stay in powder form, since pressing it into counterfeit pills made it look like something people already trusted. Instead of dealing with raw product that scared off casual users, sellers now had blue tablets stamped to resemble oxycodone, which widened the customer base far beyond the usual crowd. When those pills started circulating under names like M30s, they carried a kind of false legitimacy, which made them easier to sell while hiding how dangerous they actually were. The machines behind that process changed everything, since industrial pill presses, originally designed for pharmaceutical companies, became tools that smaller crews could now access through overseas suppliers, especially from China. Once those presses landed inside apartments or storage units, they could produce hundreds of pills within minutes, which meant even a handful of people could create supply levels that used to require large organizations. That kind of efficiency turned places like Providence into quiet production hubs, since the work could happen indoors without needing open-air dealing that attracts police attention. As more crews caught on, the whole structure started looking less like street dealing and more like a controlled system, where powder came in from outside sources, while finished pills moved out through local networks tied to nearby states. That flow stayed steady along routes connecting Rhode Island to Boston, New York, and even further south, which gave the operation a reach far beyond what anyone would expect from such a small state. By the time law enforcement began noticing patterns, the foundation had already been built, which meant the real story was not about one location, but about how an entire system quietly took shape. Long before federal agents kicked in any doors, people around Providence had already started hearing things, though nobody could fully prove what was going on at the time. Inside barbershops on Broad Street and late-night spots around South Providence, conversations kept circling back to a new product moving through the city, which people casually called blue babies, without really understanding what was inside them. As those pills passed from hand to hand, stories spread about how strong they were, which made some users chase them while others started getting nervous about what they were really taking. Those whispers did not stay limited to street talk, since neighbors in certain areas began noticing patterns that felt out of place compared to normal daily routines. In parts of Pawtucket and the Providence border, residents recalled late-night deliveries, where unmarked vehicles pulled up carrying heavy crates that looked more industrial than personal. While those deliveries happened quietly, the timing stood out, since they often came long after most people had gone inside. which made a few residents question what kind of operation needed that level of secrecy. As time moved forward, the signs became harder to ignore, since some tenants reported hearing constant mechanical sounds coming from inside specific apartments, which did not match typical household activity. Those sounds came in steady rhythms, almost like machinery running in cycles, which led some people to guess it might be construction or equipment work happening indoors. When you add that to the unusual deliveries, the picture started forming slowly, even though nobody could confirm exactly what was happening behind those walls. What really pushed the rumors further was the location of one suspected operation, since it sat within a short distance of a school, which made the whole situation feel off to anyone paying attention. Parents walking their kids through the neighborhood noticed unfamiliar faces coming in and out at odd hours, while others pointed out that certain windows stayed covered most of the time. Even without clear proof, that combination created a quiet tension, where people felt something was wrong but could not fully explain it. Despite all those signs, nobody stepped forward with concrete information, and that hesitation had roots in how things worked on the street long before this situation even developed. In neighborhoods shaped by years of distrust toward law enforcement, speaking up could bring attention nobody wanted, especially when people believed those involved might retaliate. As a result, most residents chose to mind their business, even when things did not add up, which allowed the operation to continue building without immediate interference. That silence created space for the rumors to grow stronger, since every new detail added another layer to what people thought might be happening behind closed doors. Some believed a full pill operation was already running, while others thought it was just small-time dealing that got exaggerated through conversation. Either way, the uncertainty kept the story alive without ever reaching a point where it forced action, which meant whatever was happening had time to expand before anyone truly stepped in. By the time those rumors started stacking up across Providence and Pawtucket, one name quietly sat behind a lot of that activity, and that name was Jorge J. Pimentel, a Dominican man living low-key in Pawtucket. While most people around him saw just another resident moving through daily life without drawing attention, federal documents later showed he was running something far bigger than street-level dealing. He was not loud about it, nor was he flashy like others chasing status, which actually helped him stay off the radar while building a system that kept producing day after day. That kind of quiet approach made him dangerous in a different way, since nobody really focused on him until law enforcement stepped inside and saw everything laid out. Once investigators executed the February 7, 2022 search warrant at his apartment, the inside told a story that matched every rumor people had been passing around without proof. Officers found an industrial pill press set up in a room that looked more like a small factory than a place where somebody lived, which showed this was not improvised work, but something organized. Nearby, large containers held mixtures of fentanyl powder combined with acetaminophen, caffeine, and blue dye, which gave the final product that familiar pharmaceutical look people trusted at first sight. That process was not random, since the blending had to reach a certain consistency before it could be fed into the machine. And once it did, the press started stamping pills at a pace that felt unreal for a small apartment. As agents documented the scene, they recovered around 53,000 finished pills already prepared for distribution, while nearly 9 kilograms of powder sat ready for further production, which pointed to a much larger capacity than what was immediately visible. According to the federal sentencing memorandum, that amount of material could have produced more than 633,000 pills if everything had been processed fully, which shows how close this operation sat to flooding entire regions with supply. That kind of scale did not require a large crew moving openly through the streets, since a few people working behind closed doors could generate numbers that matched organized networks. When you look at it from that angle, the apartment was not just a stash spot, but a full production hub running quietly inside a residential building. The location added another layer that made the situation hit different once it became public, since the building sat within 1,000 feet of a school, which triggered serious legal consequences once the case moved forward. That detail mattered in court, since drug manufacturing or distribution near a school zone brings enhanced penalties, but it also mattered to the community in a way that went beyond legal language. Parents later expressed anger once they realized that something this dangerous was operating so close to where children moved every day, especially when those same pills had already started showing up on the streets. Some neighbors even said they believed the location was chosen deliberately, thinking nobody would expect that kind of operation sitting next to a place tied to kids. When you break down the daily output of that setup, it becomes clear why the operation did not need to rely on constant street activity to stay profitable, since the machine could push out tens of thousands of pills in a short window of time. Even working in limited cycles, the press allowed production levels that could support multiple distribution routes at once, which tied directly into the wider network already forming across state lines. That kind of efficiency meant fewer risks during transport, since smaller amounts of powder could be turned into large volumes of product locally without moving bulky shipments repeatedly. Over time, that approach made operations like Pimentel's harder to detect, since everything happened indoors without obvious signs unless someone looked closely. What made the situation even more dangerous was the fact that the pills themselves contained SAT, since the mixing process did not guarantee consistent dosing across every tablet produced. Some pills carried smaller amounts of fentanyl, while others contained levels strong enough to shut down a person's breathing within minutes, which turned each one into a gamble for whoever took it. That inconsistency is what led to multiple overdoses across Rhode Island during that period, with some cases later tied back to pills produced through operations like this one. In one reported instance, a 17-year-old died after ingesting a counterfeit pill that investigators traced to this type of manufacturing process, which shows how the impact reached far beyond the people running the operation. As the case developed in court, Pimentel eventually pleaded guilty, and in 2023 he received a 20-year federal prison sentence, which reflected both the scale of the operation and the risks tied to what he produced. Even with that outcome, the story did not stop at his arrest, since his role connected directly to a larger network still operating across multiple states. What his apartment revealed was not just one man's setup, but a blueprint showing how small indoor operations could feed a much bigger system without drawing early attention. Once that became clear, investigators started looking beyond the walls of that building, since it was obvious this was only one piece of something much larger moving quietly through the region. As investigators started connecting the pieces from Pawtucket to Providence, one name kept surfacing behind the scenes, and that name was Josh Perez, a figure who did not move like a typical street dealer. While Jorge Pimentel handled production at a ground level, Perez operated from a different position, building connections that stretched beyond Rhode Island into a wider network that moved product across multiple states. He grew up in Providence inside a Dominican household that carried strong ties to law enforcement, which made his path stand out once everything came to light. His uncle, Oscar Perez, worked his way up through the Providence Police Department to eventually become chief, while another uncle, Andres Perez, served as a sergeant focused on intelligence work, which placed law enforcement inside his immediate circle from early on. That background shaped how people viewed him in the neighborhood, since he was not seen as someone expected to move into large-scale trafficking, especially with that kind of family structure around him. Friends described him as someone who stayed calculated, thinking ahead instead of reacting emotionally, which helped him avoid drawing attention during his early years. Even when he moved through local spaces, he did not carry himself like someone trying to prove a point, which allowed him to blend into environments where others might stand out. That kind of presence became part of his advantage later, since it helped him build trust with people who might otherwise keep their distance. His first serious run-in with law enforcement came in July 2017, when a Rhode Island state trooper pulled him over for a traffic violation, which turned into something bigger within seconds. Before the officer reached the vehicle, Perez tossed a bag containing about 3 ounces of cocaine out the passenger window, hoping to distance himself from the evidence before the situation escalated further. Once the vehicle was searched, officers recovered another bag of cocaine, along with roughly $10,000 in cash and multiple cell phones, which pointed toward activity beyond personal use. Despite that arrest, the case dragged through the system, and when it finally settled, he received a suspended sentence along with community service, which meant he avoided a long-term incarceration at that point. That outcome did not slow him down the way some might expect, since federal records later showed he had already been moving within larger circles even before that incident took place. Instead of stepping back, he leaned further into building something more structured, shifting his focus toward operations that looked less like street dealing and more like business transactions. He spoke openly in recorded conversations about wanting to operate at a level where he supplied other dealers rather than interacting directly with users, which allowed him to control volume while limiting exposure. That mindset helped him position himself as someone running logistics rather than standing on corners, which changed how his role functioned inside the network. What made his approach different was how he presented himself, since he did not fit the usual image people associate with drug trafficking at that scale. Wiretaps later captured him talking about discipline, routines, and even reading business-focused material, which gave him the appearance of someone chasing legitimate success rather than operating in the shadows. He paid attention to structure, mentioning things like planning investments, managing cash flow, and thinking long-term, which separated him from individuals who focused only on quick returns. That kind of thinking allowed him to move through different environments without raising suspicion, since he looked more like a businessman than someone tied to illegal production. As money started coming in, Perez began building a portfolio that made his lifestyle appear grounded in legitimate ventures, even though much of it traced back to his role inside the fentanyl network. He purchased multiple properties across Providence and nearby areas, including a house in Johnston valued at around $480,000, which later became part of federal asset forfeiture. Alongside real estate, he invested in cannabis dispensaries, placing himself inside a legal market that provided a layer of separation between his public image and his underground activity. He also operated Lovera VIP, a nightclub on Broad Street, which became a visible part of his lifestyle, where money flowed openly through events, bottle service, and high-end spending. That combination created a balance between visibility and control, since he could show success in public spaces while keeping the more critical parts of his operation hidden behind closed doors. Reports from WPRI described him as someone who moved large quantities of fentanyl while maintaining a presence in nightlife scenes, where he spent heavily without appearing reckless. At the same time, he talked about expanding into international real estate, even mentioning trips to Colombia, where he considered purchasing property, which suggested he saw himself building something beyond local operations. Those moves reinforced the idea that he was thinking long-term, treating the operation like a business system rather than a temporary hustle. At the center of all this sat a dual identity that made his story more complex once everything surfaced, since he was not operating as just a supplier or just a public figure, but both at the same time. On one side, he maintained relationships with family, supported relatives, and positioned himself as someone building a future through investments, which made it easier for people close to him to accept what they saw on the surface. On the other side, federal investigators described him as leading a network that distributed large quantities of fentanyl across multiple states, which connected directly to the pill production happening in places like Pimentel's apartment. That split allowed him to move through different worlds without fully exposing either side, which is part of why the operation lasted as long as it did before collapsing. Some people around him believed he was simply a businessman taking advantage of legal opportunities, while others suspected there was more happening but could not prove it at the time. Even when rumors about his connections surfaced, especially involving his uncles in law enforcement, those claims remained unverified, which added another layer of uncertainty around his position. By the time federal authorities built their case, it became clear that Perez was not just involved, but sitting at the center of the network, coordinating supply, production, and distribution in a way that connected everything together. As investigators looked deeper into his operations, they started seeing how his decisions shaped the structure that allowed the network to grow without immediate disruption, which tied directly back to the systems he put in place. He did not just move product, but organized how it flowed, deciding where it went, who handled it, and how money returned through different channels. That level of control is what turned his role from participant into leader, which set the stage for the investigation that would eventually bring the entire operation into the open. Once investigators stepped beyond Pimentel's apartment and Perez's immediate circle, they started seeing a system that did not begin in Rhode Island, but stretched far beyond it, reaching back toward suppliers tied to Mexican cartels. Federal case files later pointed toward connections with the Sinaloa cartel, which had already built a reputation for moving fentanyl across the United States through complex supply routes. That connection mattered since the powder arriving in Rhode Island did not originate locally, instead traveling through border states like Arizona and California before reaching the Northeast through layered distribution chains. As that flow continued, traffickers used commercial shipments, hidden compartments, and coordinated handoffs to keep the movement steady without drawing too much attention at any single point. Once that powder reached Rhode Island, the process shifted from transportation to transformation, which is where operations like Pimentel's became central to the system. Instead of moving raw fentanyl in bulk form across multiple states, crews converted it into counterfeit pills inside controlled environments, which made the product easier to distribute in smaller, less noticeable quantities. Investigators later confirmed that multiple pill presses were active across different stash locations, not just one apartment, which allowed production to continue even if one site faced disruption. Those locations rotated over time, using apartments, basements, and storage units, which meant the operation did not rely on a single address that could be easily tracked or shut down. That structure created a rhythm where powder came in quietly, while finished pills moved out just as smoothly, forming a loop that kept supply consistent across multiple regions. Once pills were ready, distribution followed major highway routes, with Interstate 95 acting as a primary corridor linking Rhode Island to Massachusetts and New York. From there, shipments extended further, reaching places like Tennessee, where demand for counterfeit pills had already grown due to earlier opioid trends. Couriers handled those movements using rental vehicles and frequently changing plates, which helped reduce the chances of being flagged during routine traffic stops. Inside those routes, the system depended heavily on partnerships with local groups that already controlled certain areas, which allowed distribution to move quickly once shipments arrived. In Providence and Pawtucket, smaller crews handled street-level movement, while in Massachusetts, connections extended into cities like Boston and Lowell, where additional networks took over. Reports also mentioned ties to groups such as the Latin Kings and affiliates connected to larger motorcycle clubs, which expanded reach beyond a single demographic or territory. Those partnerships were not always stable, though, since disagreements over payments or supply delays sometimes led to tension that investigators later picked up in recorded conversations. As those relationships developed, the network began operating more like a supply chain than a loose collection of dealers, with each part handling a specific role tied to production, movement, or sales. Perez sat at the center of that structure, coordinating how products moved between these layers while maintaining control over pricing and volume. Federal complaints described transactions where thousands of pills moved in single deals, including one instance where couriers attempted to sell 25,000 pills for around $125,000, which breaks down to a little over $1 per pill at the wholesale level. That pricing allowed distributors further down the chain to increase margins, which kept the demand strong across different regions. Another documented deal showed Perez arranging the movement of 34,000 pills for roughly $37,000, which demonstrates how the operation focused on volume rather than individual sales. At that level, the goal was not to interact with users directly, but to supply those who already had access to local markets, which reduced exposure while keeping profits high. That approach also meant fewer direct transactions tied to him personally, which made it harder for investigators to connect individual sales back to the source without long-term surveillance. As investigators pieced together those transactions, they realized the scale extended far beyond what any single apartment or stash house could explain, since the network functioned across multiple states with coordinated timing. Seizures like the 141,000 pills recovered during a joint Rhode Island and Massachusetts operation later confirmed just how much product could move through this system at once. That single bus represented only a fraction of what had already circulated, which shows how much passed through before authorities fully understood the scope. By that point, it became clear that what started as a quiet operation inside residential buildings had grown into something much larger, connecting international suppliers, regional producers, and local distributors into one continuous chain. Each part depended on the others, which meant shutting down one location would not immediately stop the flow, since other pieces could continue operating while adjustments were made. That realization pushed investigators to shift their focus away from isolated raids toward understanding the entire structure, since taking down the network required more than just hitting one address. As the network expanded across state lines, the way it stayed hidden became just as important as how it produced and moved product, since any mistake could bring everything down quickly. Instead of relying on one method, Perez and his crew used layers of communication that made it difficult for investigators to track conversations in real time. Burner phones played a major role, with devices being swapped out frequently, which meant numbers changed before law enforcement could build consistent surveillance patterns. Alongside that, they leaned on apps like WhatsApp and FaceTime, since those platforms allowed them to communicate in ways that felt more casual while still avoiding traditional call records that could be easily traced. That communication style worked hand in hand with how they handled locations, since the operation never depended on a single fixed base that could be watched over time. Apartments, basements, and short-term rentals became rotating stash houses, each serving a purpose for storage, production, or temporary holding before distribution moved forward. Some locations stayed active only briefly, which reduced the risk of neighbors noticing long-term patterns that might raise suspicion. When one spot felt compromised or too visible, they shifted operations elsewhere, keeping everything moving without giving investigators a stable target to lock onto. That constant movement also extended to how the product itself was handled, since the network avoided moving large quantities in ways that could attract immediate attention during transport. Instead of loading obvious shipments, they broke down distribution into smaller loads, which moved through everyday vehicles that blended into normal traffic patterns. In some cases, decoy shipments were used, where less valuable drugs like marijuana were placed in certain vehicles to distract attention, while higher value fentanyl pills moved separately through other routes. That kind of misdirection created confusion, especially during the early stages of investigation, since it made it harder to determine which movements mattered most. While those tactics handled the physical side of the operation, another layer existed in how people perceived the network, particularly when it came to rumors surrounding possible protection from within law enforcement. In Providence, conversations often circled around Perez's family connections, especially his uncles, who held positions inside the police department, which led some people to believe he had access to inside information. Those claims were never proven in court, and both Oscar Perez and Andres Perez denied any involvement, yet the speculation did not fade, since the idea of protection made sense to those trying to explain how the operation lasted as long as it did. Even former officials later suggested that some of those rumors may have been exaggerated, though they still acknowledged that perception alone could influence how people behaved around the situation. That perception carried weight in the streets, since people who believed someone was protected tended to stay quiet, rather than risk getting involved in something they did not fully understand. When that mindset spread through a community, it created a kind of shield around the operation, where fewer people questioned what they saw or heard. Even when unusual activity became noticeable, the idea that someone might be connected to law enforcement discouraged individuals from speaking openly, which allowed the network to continue without early disruption. Over time, that silence became part of the system itself, reinforcing the sense that everything was under control. Looking at how long the operation stayed active, it becomes clear that it was not just one tactic that kept it running, but a combination of strategy, confidence, and gaps within the system that allowed it to move unnoticed for extended periods. The crew operated with a level of discipline that avoided unnecessary attention, while law enforcement needed time to build a case strong enough to hold up in court, which slowed immediate action. During that window, the network continued producing and distributing at scale, growing more established as each cycle passed without interruption. That balance between risk and control created an environment where the operation felt stable from the inside, even as pressure slowly built from outside investigations that were not yet visible. For those involved, it likely seemed like the system would continue working as long as they stayed consistent with their methods, which added to the confidence driving their decisions. At the same time, that confidence became part of the problem, since it encouraged them to keep expanding without recognizing how much attention they were already drawing behind the scenes. By the time the investigation reached its later stages, the very structure that helped them stay hidden had also given authorities enough time to understand how everything connected. As the network kept moving product across states without obvious disruption, federal authorities began stepping in quietly around September 2019, when the Organized Crime Drug Enforcement Task Force in Boston started building a long-term case. That task force brought together agents from the DEA, FBI, IRS Criminal Investigation, Rhode Island State Police, plus local departments, which meant the investigation was not rushed, but carefully layered over time. Instead of making early arrests that might tip people off, they focused on watching patterns, mapping connections, and understanding how each part of the system worked together. That approach took patience, since they needed to see the full structure before making any moves that could hold up in court later. Once they secured the necessary warrants, investigators began tapping into communications, which opened a window into how Perez and his crew actually operated day to day. Wiretaps captured conversations where he discussed production schedules, supply concerns, and distribution plans, which gave agents direct insight into how decisions were made inside the network. In some calls, he talked about pressing tens of thousands of pills in a single run, while in others, he handled disagreements with partners over delayed payments or missed deliveries. Those recordings also showed how he maintained control, since he corrected mistakes quickly and kept operations moving even when issues came up. As those conversations stacked up, agents started noticing tension within the crew itself, which became another angle they could use to apply pressure over time. Some members worried about being watched, especially when talk of surveillance cameras and unfamiliar vehicles started coming up during calls. Perez himself mentioned checking for gray boxes, referring to possible cameras or monitoring equipment, which showed he understood the risk even if he could not see how close investigators already were. That awareness created small cracks inside the group, since once people start thinking about exposure, their behavior changes in ways that can be tracked. At the same time, investigators began working on turning individuals within the network into informants, which gave them access to information they could not get through surveillance alone. Some of those people were already facing charges in separate cases, which made cooperation a way to reduce their own sentences while providing details about the operation. Through those informants, agents learned about stash house locations, delivery schedules, and the roles different members played inside the system. That kind of inside information allowed them to confirm what they were hearing on wiretaps, which strengthened the case as it developed. As pressure increased, the risk of exposure started growing for everyone involved, even if they did not fully realize how much information had already been collected. Every conversation, every movement, and every transaction added another layer to the investigation, which meant the margin for error kept shrinking. Some crew members became more cautious, while others continued operating normally, not knowing how much had already been documented behind the scenes. That imbalance created openings for investigators, since inconsistent behavior often revealed more than careful planning. Tracking physical movement became another key part of the case, since agents placed GPS devices on vehicles tied to Perez and his associates, allowing them to follow routes in real time. Those trackers showed how frequently cars moved between Rhode Island, Massachusetts, and New York, which matched the distribution patterns they had already identified through other evidence. In addition to that, surveillance teams monitored suspected stash houses, watching who entered, how long they stayed, and what activity took place over time. When combined with communication records, those observations helped to build a complete picture of how the operation functioned day after day. While all of this unfolded, the investigation also carried a layer of controversy that added complexity to how the case was perceived both inside and outside law enforcement circles. Federal prosecutors later suggested that Sergeant Andres Perez may have been a knowing or unwitting participant, pointing to recorded conversations where his nephew contacted him while concerned about surveillance. In one instance, Josh asked whether anyone was watching his vehicle, and Andres responded in a way that prosecutors highlighted during court proceedings, though he later stated he did not realize the full situation. Despite those claims, no charges were filed against him or his brother Oscar, which left the issue unresolved in legal terms. That lack of formal charges did not stop speculation from spreading, especially within the community, where people had already been questioning how the operation lasted as long as it did. Some believed the family connections provided an extra layer of protection, while others argued that the rumors were exaggerated and that investigators simply took time to build a strong case. Even officials reviewing the situation later suggested that Perez may have used his family ties to create an image of protection, which could discourage people from looking too closely at his activities. Regardless of which view people believed, the controversy became part of the story, shaping how the investigation was understood by those watching from the outside. As all these pieces came together, the case moved closer toward a point where action could no longer be delayed, since the volume of evidence had reached a level that supported coordinated arrests. Investigators had mapped the network, recorded its communications, tracked its movements, and identified key players, which meant the next step would shift from observation to enforcement. By that stage, the operation that once moved quietly through Rhode Island had already been fully outlined behind the scenes, even though those involved continued working as if nothing had changed. By the time February 7th, 2022 arrived, federal agents already had months of surveillance, recordings, and movement data lined up, which meant the operation had reached a point where waiting no longer made sense. Early that morning, teams moved in on multiple locations across Rhode Island, including addresses in Providence, Pawtucket, and Johnston, hitting them almost at the same time to prevent anyone from tipping others off. As doors came down and officers pushed inside, they moved quickly through each space, knowing that every second mattered when dealing with an operation that had already shown how organized it was. That coordination ensured nobody had time to shut things down or clear evidence before agents secured the scenes. Inside those locations, what agents found confirmed everything they had been building toward during the investigation, since the scale matched what wiretaps and informants had already suggested. At one stash house on Emera Avenue, officers recovered around 14 kilograms of powdered fentanyl, along with roughly 9 kilograms of pressed pills, which showed active production had been happening up until the moment they arrived. In other locations, they found additional pill presses, cash stacks reaching into tens of thousands of dollars, and marijuana grow setups hidden behind modified electrical systems, which added another layer to how the operation managed its finances. Each site revealed a different part of the system, from production to storage to financial handling, which made it clear this was not a single operation, but a coordinated network. As agents moved through those properties, they also uncovered evidence of how the operation tried to blend into normal surroundings, since some rooms were arranged to look ordinary until closer inspection revealed their real purpose. Hidden compartments, sealed containers, and carefully organized supplies showed that everything had been planned with efficiency in mind, allowing production to continue without interruption. Those details reinforced what investigators already knew, which was that this network had been running consistently for a long time rather than operating in short bursts. By the time the searches were completed, the amount of material seized painted a clear picture of a system capable of producing and distributing at a level far beyond what most people expected from that area. While all of this unfolded, one key figure was not at any of those locations, since Jazz Druel Josh Perez had already left Rhode Island before agents reached him that morning. According to tracking data and recorded calls, he had been active late the night before, still involved in coordinating production and deliveries, which shows he did not indicate that the raids were about to happen. Once the operation was hit, he made his way to New York, creating a short window where he remained outside immediate custody while the rest of the network started collapsing around him. Even during that period, investigators later confirmed that he continued arranging deals, including coordinating a transaction involving around 19,000 pills, which shows he did not immediately step away from the operation, despite knowing something had gone wrong. That brief escape did not last long, since law enforcement already had enough information to track his movements once he returned toward Rhode Island. On February 13, 2022, just days after the initial raids, Rhode Island state troopers conducted a traffic stop that led directly to his arrest, bringing the central figure of the network into custody without a prolonged chase. Once detained, he was transported to the Donald W. Wyatt detention facility in Central Falls, which placed him back inside the same region where the operation had been built. That moment marked a turning point, since the person coordinating the network was no longer able to manage its remaining pieces from the outside. As the dust settled from those raids and arrests, the full scale of the operation started becoming clearer through official reports and court filings that followed. Prosecutors outlined how Perez and his associates had distributed approximately 200 kilograms of fentanyl while producing millions of counterfeit pills, which transformed the story from a local case into something much larger. Those numbers explained why overdoses had spiked during that period, since the volume of pills moving through the region created widespread exposure beyond a single neighborhood. What had once looked like isolated incidents now connected back to a coordinated system that had been feeding supplies into multiple states at once. Looking back at how everything came together, the raids did not just shut down a few locations, but exposed an entire structure that had been operating quietly in plain sight for years. The combination of seized drugs, equipment, and financial evidence showed how production, distribution, and profit all connected under one network, which investigators had spent years mapping out before making their move. For those involved, the sudden collapse likely felt unexpected, since the system had been running without interruption long enough to create a sense of stability. From the outside, though, it became clear that the operation had already been fully understood before those doors were ever breached. Once the arrest settled and the evidence got organized, the case moved into federal court, where prosecutors laid out charges that reflected how wide the operation had spread across multiple states. Jazz Druel Josh Perez faced counts tied to conspiracy to distribute and possess with intent to distribute fentanyl, along with charges connected to pill presses and financial activity tied to laundering proceeds. The indictment did not focus on isolated transactions, since it described a system where production, movement, and money all worked together under one structure. By framing it that way, prosecutors aimed to show that Perez was not just involved, but directing how the operation functioned from start to finish. Alongside him, several co-defendants appeared in court, each tied to a different role inside the network that investigators had mapped out during the earlier phases. Eric Ventura, described as a trusted lieutenant, handled transport and delivery, moving large quantities of product between states while keeping supply lines active. Jorge Pimentel, already identified through the Pawtucket lab, represented the production side, where pills were manufactured in controlled environments before being distributed outward. Other individuals connected to the case included people who handled specific deals, such as Roberto Nieves Zayas and Mervyn Cabral Roche, who attempted to sell tens of thousands of pills to an undercover agent before their arrests. Each person's involvement added another layer to how the operation worked, showing it depended on coordination rather than isolated actions. As proceedings moved forward, several of those defendants chose to plead guilty, which shifted the dynamic inside the courtroom, since their cooperation strengthened the case against others. Some admitted to transporting pills, while others acknowledged roles in production or distribution, which gave prosecutors direct testimony about how the system operated internally. Those pleas also reflected the pressure created by the evidence already collected, since fighting charges tied to wiretaps and seizures carried significant risk. In exchange for reduced sentences, cooperating witnesses provided details about schedules, payments, and responsibilities, which helped confirm the structure investigators had already outlined. The evidence presented during these proceedings came from multiple sources that all pointed toward the same conclusion, which made it difficult for the defense to challenge the overall narrative. Wiretap recordings captured conversations where Perez discussed operations, pricing, and logistics, giving jurors insight into how decisions were made behind the scenes. Financial records showed how money moved through properties, businesses, and accounts, linking income from drug sales to investments in real estate and other ventures. Physical evidence from the raids, including pill presses, powder, and finished pills, provided a direct connection between the operation and the substances being distributed across different regions. As the case reached its later stages, attention centered on Perez, since his role placed him at the top of the network described throughout the investigation. After initially resisting, he eventually entered a guilty plea to conspiracy charges, which avoided a full trial, but still left sentencing in the hands of the court. During sentencing, prosecutors emphasized the scale of the operation, noting that approximately 200 kilograms of fentanyl had been distributed and millions of counterfeit pills had been produced. The judge considered those factors along with his leadership role, ultimately sentencing him in February 2025 to 22.5 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years of supervised release. In addition to that sentence, the court ordered the forfeiture of assets tied to the operation, including properties, bank accounts, and vehicles, which aimed to strip away the financial gains built during that period. Those seizures included real estate holdings and investments that had been presented as legitimate ventures, which showed how profits from illegal activity had been integrated into broader financial structures. By targeting both the individual and the assets, the court sought to address not just the actions, but the benefits that came from them. That outcome reinforced how the case extended beyond drug distribution into financial activity that supported the operation's growth. Other defendants received different outcomes based on their roles and decisions during the process, which reflected how federal sentencing considers both involvement and cooperation. Jorge Pimentel, whose apartment had served as a production site, had already been sentenced in 2023 to 20 years in federal prison after pleading guilty to his charges. Eric Ventura received a 10-year sentence after admitting his role in transporting and distributing drugs within the network. Additional individuals tied to specific deals or activities received sentences ranging from several years to over a decade, depending on the scale of their involvement and whether they cooperated with investigators. As those sentences were handed down, the courtroom phase brought a formal end to the legal side of the case, even though the broader impact extended beyond those proceedings. What had started as a quiet operation inside residential spaces became a federal case involving multiple agencies, detailed evidence, and coordinated prosecutions across different jurisdictions. The structure laid out during the trial showed how each part of the network contributed to the whole, from production to distribution to financial handling. By the time the final sentences were issued, the system that once operated quietly had been fully exposed, leaving behind a record that detailed how it functioned from start to finish. Once the court wrapped everything up, the impact did not stop inside those legal documents, since the damage had already spread across Rhode Island in ways that could not be reversed. During the years when counterfeit pills circulated heavily between 2021 and 2024, overdose cases increased, with several linked directly to fentanyl-laced tablets that looked like prescription oxycodone. Some of those cases involved teenagers who believed they were taking something safer, which made the outcome hit harder once toxicology reports confirmed what was actually inside those pills. In one documented case, a 17-year-old died after ingesting a counterfeit tablet tied to production methods like those used in Pimentel's setup, which showed how the consequences reached far beyond the people running the operation. As those details became public, the reaction inside Providence and Pawtucket shifted from quiet suspicion to open frustration, especially once residents learned that part of the operation had been running within a school zone. Parents questioned how industrial equipment could be brought into residential buildings without raising earlier concerns, while others focused on how long the activity continued before intervention happened. Community meetings reflected that anger, with people speaking about trust being broken in a place where families expected a basic level of safety. That feeling was not limited to one neighborhood, since the story spread across the state. shaping how people viewed both the case and the systems around it. At the same time, the situation placed pressure on the Dominican community, since many residents felt the coverage risked painting a broader group based on the actions of a few individuals. Local organizations pushed back against that narrative, emphasizing that most Dominican families in Rhode Island were focused on business, work, and stability rather than anything tied to trafficking. Still, the case created internal tension, since some community members felt frustration toward those involved, while others worried about how the story would affect perceptions outside their neighborhoods. That balance between accountability and identity became part of the ongoing conversation long after the arrests were made. The controversy surrounding potential law enforcement connections did not disappear either, even though no charges were filed against Oscar Perez or Andres Perez during the investigation. Questions about whether family ties influenced how long the operation continued remained part of public discussion, especially among those who already felt distrust toward institutions. Officials maintained that no evidence supported claims of direct involvement, yet the existence of those allegations affected how the case was viewed, particularly in communities where skepticism had already been present. That situation left a gap between official conclusions and public perception, which has not fully closed since. Even with the main figures removed from the streets, the underlying structure that supported the operation did not vanish, since demand for fentanyl and counterfeit pills remained steady across multiple regions. Law enforcement agencies noted that after the arrests, new individuals began stepping into similar roles, using many of the same methods that had already been established. Seizures like the 140,000 pills recovered in 2025 during a joint Rhode Island and Massachusetts operation showed that production and distribution continued, even if the faces involved had changed. That pattern highlighted how removing one network did not eliminate the broader system driving the activity. Looking at the situation as a whole, the case closed one chapter while leaving the larger story unfinished, since the conditions that allowed the operation to grow still exist in different forms. The raids, arrests, and sentences disrupted a network that had been operating at scale, yet they did not fully stop the flow of fentanyl moving through the same routes. What happened in Rhode Island showed how quickly a small state could become part of something much bigger, especially when systems aligned in a way that allowed it to develop quietly. The factory was shut down, the key players were sentenced, yet the pipeline that fed the entire operation continues to move, leaving a situation that feels resolved on paper while remaining active in reality.